press. Yeah, in which case I'm going to press the start recording button, which means technically we are. I mean, we're not live. Hello, everyone in the chat. We're not live. Good evening. This is Rail Natter, but we are live for you in the future listening to this episode. Hannah and I are not live. Well, we're live in our times. It's confusing. Don't worry about it, everyone. It's episode 180 of Rail Natter. Probably titled Fly Less for Better Holidays, but possibly an alternative title that I will edit in right now, with Hannah Lawrence, which is exciting. Hannah is waiting in the wings, as it were. Before we go on and talk about the subject matter at hand, it's episode 180, which means we have to very briefly shout out the Class 180 Adelante, the Alstom train. What's interesting about this, and this allows me a segue into talking about planes, because here it is in its original livery for First Great Western. They have a habit of catching fire, these trains, don't mind. Is that this is what the Pendolino would have looked like, everyone. So Richard Branson's tilting Pendolinos, originally they were going to look like this weird sort of Darth Vader nose. And here's a load of mock-ups, indeed a big plastic mock-up that Darth Vader, well, I suppose he is Darth Vader, that Richard Branson is stood next to. So they are for the nerds, but obviously it ended up looking rather different to that in its final guise. And also there's a picture of the front of an Adelant of a 180 for the people who want to look at what train noses look like when they're sat in a depot ready to be fitted. If it crashes into something. Anyway, there we are, that's enough. That allows me a segue from Virgin Trains to Virgin Flights, because we are talking about tonight. We are going to be talking about the air industry, and not for the first time, because we've got another episode coming out about the air industry and about how it's not economically viable in the UK, or it certainly provides no economic benefit for the UK. That's another episode which is very interesting, and actually I'm glad I've recorded it before this one, Hannah, because there's some interesting stuff in there, even though actually that episode is going to go out after the one we're recording right now. It's very confusing. So anyway... Hannah's waiting patiently while I cold open this episode. I'm going to keep my mouth shut. I'm going to introduce the episode. Everyone, welcome to tonight's Rail Natter. And as the In-City 225 fades away, we're here to talk about... Actually, we've said Fly Less for... I mean, the provisional title that might end up getting changed in post, everyone, there, a little peek behind the curtain, is Fly Less for Better Holidays. But actually, we're going to be talking a lot about bullshit flights, about private jets. And to do that, I'm very, very pleased to say we have Hannah Lawrence from Stay Grounded joining us. Hannah, finally, you've been waiting for me to actually introduce you in, going, what on earth is going on? What have I let myself in for? Hannah, firstly, if you'd like to introduce yourself, thank you for joining us, but if you want to introduce yourself, tell everyone who's listening and watching what you do, and yeah, a little bit about Stay Grounded, if you like.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So yes, I'm Hannah Lawrence. I am a communications campaigner at Stay Grounded. We are an international network of over 200 member organisations, and we campaign on the issue of aviation and also on related subjects like carbon offsetting and the industry's greenwashing, basically.
Yeah. So it's something we hear a lot about, and you know we've had a recent episode looking at how boiler conversion is a similar thing, with lots of lobbying, lots of kind of large scale what end up ultimately becoming fossil fuel interests kind of vying for what's the right solution, electrification with heat pumps versus magical hydrogen boilers, and so yeah, this stuff is rife, and we have it in transport as well, solutions that purport to be the perfect solve all that actually are not, and we have it in rail. And aviation is particularly guilty for it. Having just recorded an episode that talked briefly about Jet Zero, which is just was a report of government just going, actually, everyone can fly as much as they like because it's fine, was essentially what the report said, which is just a bit baffling. But yeah, so I'm so glad you joined. So without further ado, let us talk about it, and let's start with the context, I think, because you've sent through a few images to just sort of guide us through kind of this, navigate our way through a bit of an odyssey of the problems with flying, and so this image is a really stark one. I thought you might want to describe what we're looking at, and then talk about this a little bit if you can, Hannah.
Yeah, so this is a infographic I sent through, which I thought was really important because for me, or for me wanting to work on aviation was a lot because of the issue of climate justice. And
Yeah.
it's something we do a lot of, focusing on at Stay Grounded. And this infographic basically highlights the percentage of the world's population that fly, and it shows that only 1% of the world's population cause 50% of commercial aviation emissions. And 80% of the world's population have never actually set foot on a plane.
Yeah.
So I think this, for me, when I first heard this, it really just put it in context for me, because I think in Europe, in North America, it's really easy to feel like flying is really ubiquitous, it's really normalized, and actually, like, this really shows what a small percentage of the world's population are responsible for the majority of aviation emissions, and how much disparity there is, and how much of a luxury mode of transport this is.
It is. It's a mode of transport for the few, for the few is an understatement, for a tiny minority of the planet's population, and yet the damage that it causes, the impact of emissions is, it's pretty staggering. Yeah, this graphic's pretty stark. Even in the UK, even in a country, so it doesn't. We don't have to look globally for that inequality. The discussion I had actually yesterday in pre-record land was that only 50% of people in the UK fly, have ever flown. It's even within the UK, which frankly is a very unequal country. That inequality, that transport inequality, exists even for one country, let alone looking globally. And that 80% fact, that 80% of the world's population never set foot on an airplane is pretty stark. It's a pretty stark. So if we're talking about climate justice and the balance of who faces the externalities and the impacts of climate change versus the people who caused it, this is a really good example of it being very much the 1% aren't going to suffer the problems and everyone else is going to pretty stark. So I mean, it's a really nice infographic. It's a nice way to just capture that image. And I suppose if we jump to the next image, it's interesting to unpick that. So there's two categories that you've alluded to in the two graphics that you sent through: bullshit flights and legitimate flights that are interesting, because the common thing that you get back is, I fly to see family in the other corner of Europe, over in Southeast Europe, in Serbia. I fly. We're all hypocrites in this sense, in that all of us have, often those of us in this sort of sphere have flown in the campaigning sphere. People in the global north generally, the chances of us having flown is quite high compared to those in the global south. But what can we consider as a legitimate flight? What everyone has their own personal view, but how would you standardize that? How would you look at that? And I suppose that's what these two infographics describe that you sent through.
Yeah, exactly. So these infographics are the result of some research that we did, some polling that we did in 2021, and they show the results of around 2,000 people's answers. So the first one is about what we would consider bullshit flights, and the second one is what we would consider legitimate flights. And they're kind of a result of people's thoughts on what are bullshit flights. And when we say bullshit flights, we're talking unfair, frivolous, unnecessary.
Yep.
So as you can see, things like weekend flights, short haul flights, these incredibly low cost flights, obviously private jet flights, and then things like supersonic flights, then going into deportation flights and business class, military flights and night flights. So firstly, these were a kind of attempt to start this conversation, because I think that's the first thing. We often don't have this conversation, and because, like we kind of just touched on, we don't always recognize that flying is such a luxury form of transport and that it does feel so ubiquitous. We don't have these conversations around unnecessary, frivolous flying. So that was kind of the first thing, to just start this conversation that we feel we should be having as a society. And secondly, to kind of start trying to categorize and identify flights which are unfair. and unnecessary, so that we can start finding policy measures.
Yeah. Because it's building it's consensus building, right? And so even with the pressing need, there is a need to build consensus. So just to clarify, these numbers are the number of people out of those. You said 2,000 people polled. The percentage who felt like a weekend flight is an unnecessary, is a frivolous flight, is a bullshit flight. 96% of those polled felt like weekend flights were in that category. Is that what the result is there?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, nice. So yeah, it's pretty stark then. There's a pretty broad agreement that these top three, particularly weekend flights, short haul flights, and incredibly cheap low cost flights. I'm surprised that those are above private jets, to be honest. I'm surprised private jet wasn't like 100% 100% agreement. But yeah, those three, weekend short haul flights and incredibly cheap low cost flights, all of them have, 88 to 96% of people polled believe those are unnecessary, frivolous flights. I'd say that's more stark, that's more unanimous than I expected it to be. That's a broader consensus than I expected it to be. It's quite something. I suppose the thing that surprises me is that only 3 out of 4 people think that private jet flights are frivolous, unnecessary. It's still a pretty decent number, don't get me wrong, but that surprised me a little bit. I was like, oh wait, what? And of course, I suppose that's slightly worrying that only 60% of people, or 58% of people, think deportation flights are unnecessary and bullshit. But I suppose that indicates that you probably had quite a good slice of society. If from the 2,000 people polled, it wasn't that you just polled 2,000 left-wing campaigners. It was quite a broad polling of society. Yeah, yeah. It is quite stark. And then you go down to the bottom, night flights, as people kind of But then you've got on the flip side of that. What's quite nice, Hannah, is that is legitimate flights. Is people think, well, okay, there is a need for flying, and people's understanding and sort of consensus around that. Talk a little bit about that and kind of how you came up with some of the categories and what the response was.
Yeah. So actually, just quickly on.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
You mentioned just a second ago with the deportation flights, for example, and I think this is why. This was a really interesting exercise to get people responding to. We also got some quite interesting comments. So with deportation flights, we did get one comment that said, deportation in itself is unethical. It's not just the flying element that makes it so. If someone has to be put through, even more stress because they get deported in a different way. Yeah. There's so it kind of was really about opening up the conversation and discussing. I think what it really brought to the fore is this issue of climate justice. It's not just the flying in isolation. It's also about us having the other these other social justice issues naturally, as with all climate issues, are always at play. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's interesting. Yeah, it's. Were there any other comments that came out? Because it's interesting to know that there were some of these nuances picked out by people. I suppose the consideration, and one of the challenges you get with flying is that, as ever, one of the challenges with punitive measures about any sort of restriction of mobility is that the rich just pay their way through that restriction. So whether it's parking costs. Invariably, that can mean that just more rich people are the ones who end up using that parking, for example, in inner city areas, or with flying. If you make flying more expensive, do you just make it the preserve of the rich? And actually, so it's interesting. There are challenges around low cost flights in that. Yes, we don't want bulk volume flights where people should be having the cheaper alternative should be for them to get the train, or them perhaps have access to more domestic holiday options. But it's an interesting discussion there, and I suppose this what's interesting about the polling that you did is opening that discussion out. Is like, how do you manage the inequality in terms of punitive measures to for example, not having air passenger duty. Well, you can argue that makes it having air passenger duty. You could argue that it makes mobility more accessible to more people, which is a good thing to reduce inequality. I would argue there's more to it there, because that discounts the fact that there's a lot of people who don't have any option to fly, who have got those flights going over their head in Slough or near the airport, that flying is never an option for them, and they have to deal with the consequences. But there is interesting discussion to be had there, I think. So it's interesting that there was that unanimity. So yeah, were there any other comments that you found interesting in that polling? Anything that came out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in terms of comments, that's the main one that always sticks in my mind. But I do think it's interesting. It was interesting getting people's thoughts and feedback, and starting to see a bit of nuance in the conversation around flying and its inequality, basically. And kind of like you just touched on, and I think we'll probably discuss this in more detail later, but it's about acknowledging this and acknowledging this inequality to then look at policy measures which would address that and would address things in an equal way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I suppose you can start looking at targeting frequent flyers rather than one-off flyers, which then I suppose is interesting because that ties into some of the commentary within legitimate flights, which I thought was interesting. So on the if we want to talk about legitimate flights, then you can see we've got. Actually, I'll let you talk through it. Actually, so there's a series of things that people there was consensus around feeling on what felt like the legitimate uses of aviation. So I just want to pick through a few of those.
Yeah, so I think it all comes down to kind of what people consider obviously fair, and obviously things like emergencies, disaster relief, those kinds of things obviously naturally hold really high. And then there's things that seemed less frivolous, visiting close family on another continent, especially, and I guess this is where nuance comes in, especially if someone doesn't have any other means to do so, and is perhaps really constrained on a low income, doesn't have
the ability to take 4 days off to get the train, for example, that sort of challenge. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And then things which kind of polled lower but are still interesting to be discussing, staying abroad for longer, and then obviously things like safe escape routes for refugees, those kinds of things. It makes sense that they rate in people's fairness, and I think it's starting from the starting point that everybody believes in a level of fairness and the importance of fairness, and it's what that looks like to different people and how we have this discussion.
There's a social contract, isn't there, with so many things. There's a dotted line within the way that our society functions, and absolutely with flying, what the consensus around what is obviously or perceived as obviously a bad type of unnecessary flying. No one has necessarily. I mean, this is the first time I've seen it properly explored. Like, we kind of, all of us roughly have an idea of what we think is like, private jet flights. That's clearly superfluous. That's probably as it seems, less consensus around that than I thought, actually. But a decent level of consensus around it. Weekend short haul flights, etc. But then things like so it's interesting that business flights. 1 in 4 people still see business flights as a legitimate. As legitimate. One of the ones that I found interesting in here is, and I suppose it's quite a long title, which I suppose would include things like academic conferences, but international convenings necessary for building relationships, solidarity, and overcoming key problems. I would agree that there can be legitimacy in that. I know that I've got lots of academic friends who are involved in flight-free campaigns and trying to encourage academics trying to encourage funding bodies to encourage funding of train travel and the hotel, perhaps on an intermediate hotel as part of that, rather than just paying for the flight, and a bit of an uphill struggle. So it's interesting seeing those included in there as well, because that's there are things like that where actually as humans it's good for us to share knowledge, and yes, the internet is one thing, but meeting in person is always more valuable than that. And how do you do that over oceans or across great distances where a lot of time would be involved? And it's interesting to see that's being considered as an element of that's being considered legitimate by the people you polled.
Yeah, I think it's also about, with all these things, there being certain questions we ask ourselves first about how necessary things are, and there being alternative options. And I think that's something we'll come on to soon, about the kind of structural issues at play and what this would look like, and what these kind of questions around legitimate and bullshit flights would look like in a policy environment which didn't privilege the aviation industry, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to avoid referring back to it more than a few more times. But it was the main report that is. It's worth noting that the main report that says how wonderful aviation is for the UK economy was written by the aviation industry, or paid for by the aviation industry. There's no coincidence there. It's a very strong lobby. So we hop forwards to talk. I'm very pleased because this feels like a reasonably easy win. Okay, not from a political perspective, but from a social consensus perspective. Private jets. So talk a little bit about private jets, about the impact of these little blighters on atmospheric carbon.
Yeah, so obviously, from a climate justice perspective, obviously private jets are the pinnacle of climate injustice, and I think that's something that most people can agree are incredibly frivolous, incredibly unfair, incredibly unnecessary. So from an emissions perspective, they can be up to 10 times more polluting than scheduled flights, and 50 times more so than an average train ride. So there's obviously a huge emissions problem here. There's also a huge issue around inequality. And we've seen recently a huge increase in the sort of number of people talking about private jets, campaigning on the issue of private jets. And I think particularly in both the climate crisis and a cost of living crisis, the very concept of private jets is starting to seem super ridiculous. Yeah. And people are sort of catching on to how incredibly unfair they are and how much they're kind of the pinnacle of this inequality in the aviation system more generally.
It's baffling that. Yeah, you're right. There are lots of other more impolite ways to describe that. The fact that these private jets are flying around. It's not just the carbon impact. It's not just the dripping privilege around it, but it's also things like airports take up a lot of land, and in order to facilitate all the private jets, that increases the land take of these enormous and often located in cheap areas near lower quality housing. Increases the land take that they're taking. It's requiring expansion of airports to deal with the additional private jets that might not be necessary, and therefore you reduce land use and blight accordingly. There's so much the kind of implications of this. I grabbed another stay grounded graphic actually to kind of add to the one that you sent through. By the way, there are loads of really nice stay grounded graphics online, everyone. If you just Google stay grounded aviation graphics, there's just a long list of it. Just Google image search and there's loads. They're great. Although my only recommendation is increase the resolution from this one up to 1080p for your graphics person. It's my only tip. But there's some really nice graphics, and so I grabbed this one because I thought it was really nice to look at what those flights look like. And for all the people watching this, knowing where there are, okay, so Eurostar is a pain in the backside, particularly at the moment with all the additional security. But when that eventually gets fixed, which I really hope it will be, you can get down, like Rome-Milan there is a high-speed connection between Rome and Milan. It's a very good one. There is a very good high-speed connection between London and Paris, a very good high-speed connection from Paris onwards in all sorts of different directions, but to Nice certainly. The idea, these are all pretty decent high-speed rail routes. So it's not necessary to have if they want, and all of those high-speed trains have business class sections. So if they want to travel in comfort and style, they can do so in a train. It's pretty baffling that it's all local. Like, this is all very short distances, relatively speaking. It's staggering, absolutely staggering. There's another fact that came out. That's just I've just gone off while it's in my brain, bouncing around. I think it was today I saw in the news that in the UK, 1 in 10 air passengers is on a private jet. That's baffling. That's absolutely Actually, no, that's not the correct statistics. 1 in 10 flights is a private jet. That would make more sense. 1 in 10 flights a private jet is with a private jet. That's baffling. That's staggering to me. Yeah, and as you say, completely unfair.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the reasons. I mean, there's obviously a number of things that feed into this, but this is one of the reasons we've got a current campaign running against private jets and for a ban on private jets and luxury emissions. Because we're also seeing, despite the climate crisis, despite the awareness and the inequality of private jets, we're seeing a huge increase in the number of private jets being used, and in private jet usage going up. Obviously, post-COVID, in the pandemic, a lot of people started using them And so it's a huge issue, and it is growing. And like you say, as you can see in the second infographic, a lot of these private jets, the most frequent routes used are for ones which are really easily accessible by train. And I think this graphic also kind of undermines a lot of the suggestions that's often put forward, which isn't justified, but is often presented that it's for these important business meetings and it's important for the economy and all of these things. And actually, like, we can see in terms of the patterns that a lot of the routes most frequently flown are in the summer for holidays, like to tourist destinations, down to Nice. Like, I think London to Nice peaks in the summer months. And so I think it really highlights this fallacy that's often presented. Not that would make it okay, even if that were true.
Yeah, and you just London, Paris, which, as we Eurostar security issues and congestion problems and capacity issues notwithstanding, the huge number of those flights, the two most popular routes there, London, Paris, and then London, Nice, pretty not far behind as well. These are served by rail, and they are very easily accepted. It's baffling that the idea that this is all desperately vital business meetings going on, or political, or that it's politics, going on. I'm not seeing London, Brussels, for example. There, Brussels doesn't seem to feature, because if there were lots of flights going in and out of Brussels, you might think, oh, maybe there's some level of political sort of activity going on there, but it's not. It looks to be like holidays. There's some good graphics that I was thinking. I think there's some graphics you were showing that show that the number of private jets in France has jumped up from like 18,000 to like some enormous number only in the matter of a few years. As I say, everyone go to the Google Stay Grounded campaign graphics. They're just really loads of really interesting facts in there to just chew through and get angry about. Some really good stuff in there. So, if we jump forwards, you've picked out a news article, and this one is obviously relevant to us in train world. Tell us about this article and what. How does it fit into some of the stuff we've already talked about?
Yeah, so this is an article I chose because I thought it really highlights some of the structural issues at play. And so for this one, Greenpeace recently released some research. They compared routes on 112 routes, so tickets, sorry, on 112 routes, and found that I think London to Barcelona was 30 times cheaper to fly than it was to get the train. So this kind of is relevant, obviously, for highlighting the difference between train travel and airline travel, but I think it really speaks to the privileged policy environment that the aviation industry benefits from. And there's a lot of different privileges that they have that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. I certainly wasn't aware when I first started looking into getting the train, and when I first started becoming aware of the issues around aviation, that, for example, in the EU, there's no tax on kerosene, which is the fuel in a plane. So whereas the fuel in your car would have tax and is taxed, there's no fuel tax on the kerosene that's in a jet. And thanks to, or no thanks, but due to a lot of industry lobbying, there's a lot of tax breaks that they receive and tax exemptions. And I think a recent report by Transport and Environment found that because of the exemptions, the very low ticket taxes, like I mentioned, the lack of tax on kerosene, and this means that airlines are actually, there's a sort of tax gap in the EU between if they were taxed fairly, as many other industries are, and what the tax they actually pay. And I think this study found that around 34.2 billion euros in tax was lost in the EU last year because of this tax gap, which, just to put it in perspective, is about the length or the cost that that money basically could have gone towards building high-speed rail track from Hamburg to Rome. So it's a huge amount of money that taxpayers are losing out on, essentially, in terms of services, in terms of other infrastructure being funded by the tax breaks given to the aviation industry.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's these are stark numbers. You know, as you say, 34 billion, tens of billions of euros of money there has been a political decision to essentially shift that money from sustainable transport to aviation. That's essentially, it's a political choice and it's interesting to explore where that comes. You know, the history of that. Aviation coming out of the Second World War was seen as the great enabler. And unfortunately, they've kind of, in order to not stifle that great enabling, then you avoid any sort of punitive tax whatsoever. Let them run free, let them do their thing. It's part of the reason why aviation industry, why it took so many challenges in the aviation industry in its early years to become safe. I know that's true for railways, but we did that 200 years ago. It took a long time for the industry to become safe, and it's still managing through a huge amount of lobbying to avoid the sorts of taxes that we see applied to driving, but indeed to trains, to diesel trains. Those trains have to pay tax on diesel, and in the UK, for example, at the moment, companies are charged an enormous amount for electricity because of the weird way that electricity is charged for in the UK. So actually, there's this huge penalising of sustainable transport. Another interesting point that is relevant to this in terms of for the UK, in terms of the perceived cost of carbon, so the cost per tonne of carbon, which I think is about £245, is what the government sort of set that at. There's a really nice graphic that I might sneak up on here actually in post, which shows that at one end of the spectrum you've got trains, which actually the cost paid by individual, or rather the subsidy, or there's a negative subsidy of about £100 or more, £150 for rail. At the opposite end of the spectrum, government is subsidising aviation entirely to the tune of that £245. So basically, aviation doesn't pay anything for its carbon output, whereas trains are disproportionately paying for their carbon output, even though obviously train carbon output is substantially less by an order of magnitude. So it's just this whole framework. So the reason I say that, it just backs up kind of this idea, this image of everything is set in the favour of the aviation industry, and it's quite challenging to unpick, I suppose. There's a lot to unpick, not just in terms of enabling infrastructure for people to not fly, but in terms of a lot of political capital that needs to be burned to reverse the situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something that people aren't often aware of. So a lot of people will just come to this issue, as consumers. They might be looking at flights, they might be looking at trains, and there's not so much awareness that there is this huge network of subsidies and exemptions that means that flights are really artificially cheap. It's not,
Yeah, it's not that's the fair, that's the fair and equal cost between the two. It's like, oh, that's just how it costs. It's the fair open market. It's like, no. No, that's not how capitalism works. It's a hugely subsidized, an enormously subsidized industry versus one that has its knees, is consistently kneecapped. Yeah, absolutely. It's a little depressing. But again, the point of understanding this is that it allows us to campaign and fight to change it, right? It's not just that we're on here getting angry about it and huffing and shrugging our shoulders. That's why you do what you do, and it's why I do what I do, is because understanding this allows us to inform people, inform consumers, but also to target politicians and make change happen. So if we jump to the next news piece, which I think it ties into what I was talking about carbon costings, actually. Tell us what this other news article you referred to is. I think this guides us into an interesting next sort of section of the piece.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring up this article, which is about some research that showed that 90% of rainforest carbon offsets by one of the biggest certifier are actually worthless and have been shown to be worthless in this research. And some of them were actually shown to be potentially worsening global heating. So it's something I thought was interesting because I think there's a lot, and we've seen, as we just touched on, the aviation industry does a really good job of greenwashing things. It does a really good job of presenting false solutions. And it's really hard for people who, just going about their daily lives, don't necessarily know that what they're being told about offsetting, for example, or about technological advances is actually greenwash, and it's actually delay from the aviation industry to continue growing the aviation industry, to continue with business as usual, and to stop any kind of pressure to implement effective climate solutions, which is hugely reducing flying.
Yep.
So offsetting is obviously something that is very often pushed by the industry, and it's something that they often rely on hugely as a way of reaching net zero targets. But there's a number of issues with this, as this article shows. Carbon offsetting projects have repeatedly failed quality control, and they, as this shows, sometimes are shown to actually worsen climate heating or global heating. Not only this, but it's often a lot cheaper for these projects to be set up in the global south. So this means that's where the majority of projects are, and this basically creates or sort of re-entrenches inequality, because it allows rich people in places like Europe, in America, as we've talked about previously, to continue flying, whilst communities in the global south have these projects set up on their land. You know, it leads to land grabbing. They're often built on indigenous communities' land. Yep. They can lead to a huge loss of livelihood for local communities. And the kind of final thing is that we need to, these projects, often tree planting or rainforest conservation projects, which are some popular ones, we need these if they were effective, which often the offsetting projects aren't, but we need these to be happening, but we also need them to be happening alongside this huge reduction in air traffic, rather than enabling it. So it's kind of a way of the industry stalling, and it actually prevents meaningful climate change, climate action. Just kind of is a license for them to continue polluting, and is worse than doing nothing.
Yeah, and we've so on Rail Now before we've talked about mining with Professor Ria Frankos, talking about these new capitalism's new colonial frontiers, and carbon offsetting industry is unfortunately absolutely yet another new colonial frontier. You know, we're revisiting, we're replaying the imperialist hits, if you like, and essentially reinventing new ways of just exploiting the global south to just kind of do what we do and shrug our shoulders and say everything's fine. What's interesting is that even closer to home, I've got friends who work in Scotland on, and there's an increase within Scotland. There is an increased interest. In fact, there's a heated interest in the carbon offsetting industry as an excuse to do lots of planting. It's like, no, we don't need carbon offsetting. Is, you know, I'm willing to say it's almost entirely greenwashing as an industry. We need to be doing the tree planting anyway. Like we need to be exactly as you said. I'm repeating you somewhat. I apologize, but it is. I just want to reiterate that point. We need to be reducing the sources of CO2 output, CO2 equivalent output, and increasing massively increasing the amount of tree coverage on the planet. These things need to be happening simultaneously. We can't keep the emissions high and then increase the forest output, because clearly that's not enough to reduce the rate of carbon output. It's very frustrating. But there are, you know, okay, the Guardian's got a few articles here of like being a bit balanced on, oh, do we, don't we, you know, carbon offsetting, it's a necessary evil and some of the stuff. But the reality is that generally it's not well thought of within academic circles, and I think if you look at it dispassionately, you might say, well, it's not very good. If you look at it in the context of who is pushing for it, we should be questioning carbon offsetting very, very vigorously, because there's a reason why it's being pushed for heavily by, for example, the aviation industry, as you rightly point out. Grim. And so this headline is revealed: more than 90% of rainforest carbon offsets by biggest certifier are worthless. You know, it's not a hugely not a hugely reassuring. It's not a great assurance of carbon offsetting. So we jump to one of Stay Grounded's campaigns. I've actually put our faces on top of the Stay Grounded logo. Sorry, Stay Grounded. Actually, I can fix this. I have the technology to fix this. In fact, Yeah, look at this on the fly editing. It's not like I don't do this all the time. There we go. So, ban private jets, end luxury emissions, sign the petition. Talk to us about this campaign, if you will, Hannah, because we've got understood the context. We've got this pretty stark bit of imagery you've got here, and this you do some very good graphics at Stay Grounded. I'm just going to say that, loving some seriously good graphic outputs. It's good work. Here we are. Ban private jets, end luxury emissions, and there's a private jet with a lot of windows flying up, with underneath it a imagery from. Actually, I'm not quite sure which country it is, but it's a flooded area. There's a flooded floodplain with a private jet taking off from it. It's a pretty stark and blunt imagery. I like it. Talk to us about this campaign.
Yeah, so we've obviously touched on private jets already, but this is a campaign that we're currently running, and this is basically kind of our first demand. It's not we ban private jets and the problem is sorted. We ban private jets because they are the pinnacle of climate injustice. And then we move on to frequent flyer levies, ending luxury emissions, talking more about policies that can reduce this huge inequality of aviation and massively reduce air traffic. So this is something that is, we're seeing a lot of traction for and a lot of calls for the banning of private jets, and it's gaining momentum. And across Europe, we're seeing a lot of actions. I think a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a month or so ago, Last Generation spray painting a private jet orange. So it's something that I think people are really getting on board with, and people are really calling for this kind of epitome of unfair travel to be addressed. And so it's something we're running a campaign on. There's more information on our website, and obviously a petition that we're running. And it's something that is kind of the first step towards then addressing frequent flyers and calling for more kind of stringent regulations and ways to tackle aviation's inequality, basically.
Yeah. And it's, what I like about it is it's a very straightforward mission. Like the mission is not straightforward, but the ask, the statement, ban private jets, end luxury emissions. It's really neat. It's a clear statement of intent, and I think it's a good one that multiple campaigns can get behind. So the likes of Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, these groups getting behind, and in fact, lots of the groups that I think you represent, that Stay Grounded, pull together as this network of groups that they can get behind. It's really good. So yeah, I think you referred to some of the action. So this next image here is. Talk to us about this image that you sent through. I think referring possibly to some of that action that you've talked about.
Yeah, I actually put this image in because I thought it was a good kind of indicator of climate action and campaigners, and a kind of good way to start talking a bit about some of the solutions and some of the things that we would really like to see, and some solutions which are so simple, like ending airport expansion, for example, putting an immediate halt on airport expansion. There's hundreds of projects currently in the pipeline or proposed to extend airports and runways across the world. And a kind of initial thing we need to see is an immediate end to those proposals. And then secondly, we need to start implementing, and as we've talked about, policies which put an end to this kind of policy environment which privileges the aviation industry. So a kerosene tax, an end to frequent flyer programs and rewards for frequent flyers, fair ticket taxes, things which across the board address that artificially cheap price of aviation, basically.
100%. And it's absolutely critical. Occasionally you hear arguments coming from people pointing out that aviation represents a small percentage of overall global emissions, but I push back on that, and I take us straight back to the first infographic you included. And that this is one of the most unequal sources of CO2 emissions. It's one of those sources that actually is quite straightforward to tackle. Like, it's not that it doesn't involve a huge impact to lots of people's lives to cut out all private jets. That includes, that's a tiny percentage of the population that would be impacted by that. So it's actually very easy climate action to do. It might not be politically easy because it's a lot of politicians' mates who they'd be asking to stop flying around. But it's from a perspective of the actual material impact on society, a very, very slight impact for a massive reduction in emissions. And it's true again of airport expansion projects. There are 10 airport expansion projects going on in the UK right now. Again, spoiler alert for everyone who's watching this live. In a few episodes from now in the future, there's another episode where we talk about airport expansion and the policy framework around that in the UK, and why that's allowed to happen, and how it's challenging to push back on it through the economics of aviation. Yeah, it makes for grim reading, to be honest, Hannah. It's just like you've described in terms of fuel, and the environment is very much set in the favour of the aviation industry for its expansion projects. Government sees expansion projects, and central government overrides local authorities. So in the UK, local authorities will go, actually, no, we don't think this is a good idea, and central government in the UK has consistently just overruled them and said, no, bring it on, do the expansion. Very frustrating. So tackling that is really key. And again, there's this, as we're seeing this image here, nicely illustrates this level of grassroots interest, this passion to get the problem sorted. And I think harnessing the fact that a lot of people who don't do campaigning feel pretty similarly about the idea that they're being asked to, use cardboard straws and like, do this and that less, and think more and more about, personal choice, when there are massive policy things that would just eradicate enormous swathes of carbon off the bat, and the aviation industry is ripe for that. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really pertinent with what you mentioned. We've obviously seen from, for example, the infographic that you showed us about the private jet flights and the most common routes and how short those distances are. Like, that's so frivolous and it's so pointless. And that's why we talk about these bullshit flights and want to start that conversation. And it's also interesting you mentioned that people often say, it's such a small percentage of global emissions, but it's such a huge issue of inequality in terms of emissions, and also often the sort of emissions that are quoted for aviation are actually incorrect, and they only consider the CO2 impacts rather than all of the other emissions that are released, which make it a much larger proportion of global emissions.
Yeah, and the high altitude of some of those emissions mean that there's an exaggerated impact in terms of greenhouse gas effect. There's an exaggerated impact of aviation, often not considered. Yeah, there's to reiterate that point. Sorry. So yeah, in terms of the physics and the chemistry going on of what's happening in terms of blanketing the planet. But yeah, as you also point out, there is also clever accounting in terms of aviation emissions. So the UK aviation emissions do not account for a sizable percentage of emissions that we are responsible for because of clever accounting. So again, the deck is very much set in favour of this polluting industry, and those who fly frequently. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to jump forwards. So there's a little graphic that you sent through saying enjoy the journey. Talk a bit about this. Talk a bit about what's on screen and these two sort of this description of this narrative. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so this is a screenshot from a guide that we put together, which was all about kind of how we talk about aviation, how we frame issues around aviation. Obviously, as we've talked about already, the aviation industry does puts a lot of effort into marketing aviation, into controlling the narrative or framing the narrative around aviation. And we wanted to talk about how we counter that, how we talk about aviation in a way that addresses the huge issues with the aviation industry and its huge climate impact. This is a particular narrative that we talk about, which I think is really interesting in the context of solutions, because it's a lot about how we can start changing our mindsets and changing the narrative around the way we travel. So it's something we call enjoy the journey, and it's all about a kind of a new approach to travel, which is about, rather than just saying, okay, how do I find the cheapest way to get to this place? It's all about how do I enjoy the journey? How do I, not take that cheap budget flight, and how do I enjoy a train ride that maybe takes me through different landscapes, really lets me get straight into the heart of the city, and I can actually make the journey part of the trip and enjoy it for what it is. So I thought it was interesting to share because it kind of highlights how we can start rethinking about our mobility system in a way that's really equitable for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, anyway, the challenge always with I'm not saying it's next. So one of the things Dina and I have done, my wife and I have done, is when we were going out to see our family in Serbia, is that a couple of times we have flown out and then got the train back, and so it's not a bad way to do it. If you're doing those sorts of journeys that you don't have the time to have 3 or 4 days in total dedicated to the journey, then do half the journey flying. Get a one-way flight and then get the train one on the way back. And we've done that. We did that twice, and it's so good. Getting the train back through Italy, a bit of time in Slovenia, get the ferry across the Adriatic. This is the stuff of magic. This is absolutely magical, amazing stuff. I cannot. And indeed, as I'll tease at the end of the episode, next week's episode and last week's episode was on one of those journeys, one of those return trips using the Belgrade Bar Railway. It's an incredible way to connect with the places that you're passing through, rather than flying over the top of them. It's brilliant. Cannot recommend it enough. And there are lots of people making this point. Someone like Mark Smith of Man in Seat 61. It's an understated website, but it's such a useful website to make these trips that are frankly quite nebulous, because there's different agencies for ticketing, and it's all rail ticketing, such a mess across the continent that it's difficult to work out what to do. Seat 61 makes it all very easy. And an incredibly popular website, because people do have this passion for this, and Flight Shame has accounted for a renaissance in European travel. This is not just we're talking about this and hoping change will happen. Change has already been happening. People are traveling by train across the continent in enormously larger numbers than they were 5 years ago, even. So this narrative is working. It's working. We should be quite excited by that. It's good to see it happening, despite the fact that fares are complicated, fares are expensive, Eurostar security sham, all this stuff. Despite all that, part of the reason that Eurostar is having problems is because so many people want to take Eurostar. So many people want to take the train to the continent. Anyway, now we talk about trains. We have to talk about. And I will recommend everyone go and listen to the Well, There's Your Problem podcast episode on Trendmire. But talk to us about what's on screen. Hannah, tell us what is on here.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring this up to mention. So it's an image that references Trendmire, which is a project in eastern Mexico where the government wants to link up Mayan archaeological sites with seaside resorts, and it's involved building this huge train network that is building straight through indigenous land. It's disrupting local communities. It's led to the cutting down of huge swathes of trees, and it threatens the water source for around 5 million people. So I kind of thought it was important to sort of stress that it's not that every train is a good train, and train networks can still be really damaging. And it's all about prioritizing local people and local communities and their needs when it comes to mobility systems. So, thinking about is this about external interests? Where's the power balance here? Who's funding this? Those kinds of things. And also this particular train project is for a kind of extractive tourism industry.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's obviously where a lot of problems come in, and a lot of the issues arise with these huge tourist industries, which can be really exploitative. So I thought it was kind of important to stress it, because I think this kind of highlights a lot of the climate justice issues we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Trendmire is an example of one of the, it's just a litany of all of the worst ways to go about building a railway line. It's entirely for external interests. The interests of the indigenous population are not just not heeded, but they're actively destroying indigenous communities. Yeah, this is an extractive. The railways have been in their past and continue to be in lots of cases deeply extractive. We train good, but not all the time, and this is a really good example of that. And yeah, so it cannot just be a switch out with another exploitative form of transport system. If you are going to build train systems, if you are going to build new transport systems, you have to not just have the buy-in. Ideally, they would be almost built from the ground up by the people that will live alongside it, so that they get the benefit that railways can provide them. Absolutely, yeah. I'm glad you include this one, because we can't just be like, yeah, that's fine. Now we just need to plaster trains across the whole of every continent on the planet, and that'll solve everything. It will not. There has to be justice. There has to be equality in the way that this impacts society. Yeah, fantastic. I mean, fantastically painful that Tren Maya is continuing to be pushed forwards. But there we go. And there's so many other places you could be building trains on the in North America. There's so much. The US, there are so many places where trains could be built that would not be causing any problems, and still are not. Anyway, you sent this little graphic through that we're ending on. 83% of people want to do more to protect nature, and 74% of respondents want to shift economic priorities away from profit and growth towards well-being and environmental protection.
Yeah, I think it's often easy to talk a lot about the problems, but it's really important to talk both about the solutions, but also about the amount of hope there is out there. And I think this was a kind of useful stat that made me feel quite positive about the fact that those of us who want to see change are the many, and this is a response from a survey that was done in all G20 countries in 2021, and I think it kind of highlights the amount of social and public consensus there is for change. And we see every day so much campaigning on aviation, whether it's private jet or actions against private jets, whether it's people campaigning against the expansion of their local airport. There is a huge amount happening right now, and I think that's a really positive thing that we can take a lot away from.
It is. And you know what? I think that's a really nice way to kind of end. I on that positive note. Often I end on a grumpy note because there's so many things to be grumpy about and get angry about, and anger is good, and if harnessed appropriately with the right information and directed appropriately. But actually sometimes it's nice to end on a high and a happy note, which is, as you say, there is that widespread support for climate action, frankly. Relevant following the bloody Uxbridge by-election in the UK, and all of a sudden everyone's talking about cutting green crap again, like Cameron said he would back in the early 2010s. Anyway, but happy note. Don't let me drag this down to a grumpy moment, Hannah. We're going to stay happy.
Yeah.
So before we'll come back to Hannah for a brief final word, but everyone who's listened to this in audio-only format, thank you very much indeed. This podcast available on all good podcasting platforms. Thank you. Drop a review. Apparently that's a good thing. I don't know why, but it is. The usual plugs, patreon.com/GarethDennis to support this continue to happen. Thanks to the Patreon supporters. GarethDennis.uk/merch to buy items that have the Railnatter logo on them and some words. For example, the Railnatter, not a metro sorter, or things that say build HS2, or things that say abolish the Treasury. The abolish the Treasury mugs are incredibly popular. Please go and buy more. And then ideally buy one and send it to your MP. That would be good. PayPal.me/GarethDennis for loose change and abuse, and GarethDennis.uk/Discord, which is where the YouTube chat. Hello, everyone in the YouTube chat. Sorry, it's another pre-record. I'm currently off on pat leave, shared parental leave again. Is at GarethDennis.uk/Discord. Yes, thank you, Discord people, Discord server. But before we say what's next episode, Hannah, a chance to talk about Stay Grounded, actually. So tell us about, you told us what Stay Grounded do, but how can people get involved? How can people support Stay Grounded? So, if I jump to the website, what I quite liked, actually, I sat on the website for a second and the kind of the thing slid past, and there's a point here you talk about climate justice, is the say union representation thinking about taking workers from the aviation industry with us? As we talk about the demise of their industry, well, we need to bring the workers with us. We don't want to do another Thatcher to the coal industry. So yeah, I quite like that. I like that pop up. But anyway, what can people do to support Stay Grounded, and what can we do to share what Stay Grounded do?
Yeah, so as a network, we're all about sharing expertise, knowledge, skills, campaigning together and supporting one another. So people can join as a group, as a campaign group, or people can join as individuals. So as you very kindly put up, this is our website, and you can go onto our website, get more information, also find ways to join if you want to join the network, or get active, use our resources, and also donate towards funding the network. And there's also, as I mentioned before, the private jet petition, which is also up on our website, and you can sign and put your voice towards that call for the end of luxury emissions, basically.
Yeah, fab. I'll include a link to the website and to the petition in the description for this episode. So yeah, thanks very much indeed for that, Hannah, and shout out to Stay Grounded. Keep doing what you do. The last thing that remains for me to do before Hannah and I say goodbye is to say next week's episode is. It's episode 181, the Belgrade Bar Railway, part 2, Užice to Kološin. I'm making my way across the Serbia-Montenegrin border. Actually, I've not finished editing this episode together yet, peek behind the curtain, but that's because time it's not a flat circle, it's wibbly-wobbly. But that's next episode. And indeed, that was part of a trip back from Serbia. We were making our way back from Serbia, and it involved trains. It didn't involve planes. It involved trains, ferries, and buses. Quite the adventure. And to be honest, the tricky bit was getting from Bar across to Italy. It was a bit of a interesting journey. Anyway, it was good fun, and that episode includes some pretty epic scenery. So get stuck in for that one. Oh, Hannah. Sorry for my waffling. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy to have you on, talk through that, hear about what Stay Grounded do, get a bit of that context for everyone to understand what's going on. So if you've got any last words you want to share, but otherwise, thanks very much, Hannah.
Yeah, I think that's everything from me, really. But thank you very much for having me on. It's been really interesting to chat to you. And yeah, thanks again for the invite. Yeah,
no, a pleasure. Everyone in the chat, thanks for joining. Everyone watching this, and indeed those watching after the fact, an absolute pleasure. It only remains for me and Hannah to say cheerio. Cheerio, everyone. Bye.
Bye.